Hi everybody, so today I'm going to be reading a poem. It's called How I Discovered Poetry by Marilyn Nelson. But before I get into the poem, I want to talk a little bit about who Marilyn Nelson is. So Marilyn Nelson is a brilliant African American poet and writer as well. She was born in Cleveland, Ohio on April 26, 1946. She was the daughter of one of the last Tuskegee Airmen named Mitchell Nelson. So she was born into a military family. Her mother's name is Johnny Mitchell Nelson, and she was a teacher. So early on, Nelson, she became interested in poetry. I want to, as she it states in elementary school. So it just shows that how quickly her interest evolved and how long she really took poetry interesting. And I think with that being said, I feel like with her cultural diversities from moving from around to many different bases as well, and her young adult life going to many different universities to pursue a lot of different degrees, it's also I feel like played a big role into her creating not only a space for poem but as well for children's books, as well for young adult books and books from a much mature audience. So I'm gonna get into the poem. So again, the poem is called How I Discovered Poetry by Marilyn Nelson. It was like soul kissing, the way the words filled my mouth as Mrs. Purdy read from her desk. All the other kids zoned an hour ahead to 3:15, but Mrs. Purdy and I wandered lonely as clouds borne by a breeze of mountain piranhas. She must have seen the darkest eyes in the room brim. The next day she gave me a poem she'd chosen especially for me, to read to all except for me white class. She smiled when she told me to read it, smiled harder, said, "Oh yes, I could." She smiled harder and harder until I stood and opened my mouth to banjo playing darkies, pickaninnies, disses, and dats. When I finished, my classmates stared at the floor. We walked silent to the buses, awed by the power of words. So, my quick explanation about this poem. For me, this poem was her first impression, and how amazed and how much that poem that the teacher read to her in class the day before really hit her soul and amazed her. It also is a very important aspect for this poem because to be have this poem written for her, for the poet as well for the speaker, because it shows how she felt and understood poem at that time period. Because again, the speaker is probably a young student as well as Mitchell Nelson. I mean, Marilyn Nelson. She was very invested in poetry at a very such young age that it shows how probably Nelson probably portrayed poetry at such a young age. There were many different word choices and as well structure, which helped improvise a lot of the poem. It was very flow. It was very easily flowed. It didn't really was difficult for me to understand, and as well, I actually enjoyed the connection it made with the student and the teacher, and how, especially during that time period, how invested a teacher was to create that for a student who probably didn't enjoy going to school every day. And as well, the power as well, it showed as well the power of words can have an effect on someone. So three techniques that I found that was very interesting for this poem as well, how it works for this poem, would have to be simile. One of the techniques is simile. A simile is, is a comparison of two things of and using like or as. So with this being said, I feel like this helped using this form of technique. It helped showed how deep the words and the connections hit her personally and reached her soul by really creating that passion and that flow with using the simile. So an example I would give from the poem would be lines 1 through 2. It was like soul kissing, the way that words filled my mouth as Mrs. Purdy read from her desk. That's very interesting to see how the words just soul kissed her. Like it touched her soul and it kissed her. Like it really, like it's like if you first kiss and your first kiss takes your soul, and with anybody, with anybody's first kiss, it's like soul kissing. Another form, a technique that I found interesting was repetition. Repetition is not really throughout this whole poem. I feel like it's more towards the middle of the poem or towards the end of the poem. But it's very interesting to state that out because it shows how deep the teacher really connected with her student and really wanted to persuade her student that confidence and give her student that confidence to express that to a class in such a way to give her classmates the same feeling that she felt. She persuaded her to gain that sense of authority and flow to create her own way to so kiss another person's soul. So a perfect example would be from the poem. She smiled when she told me to read it, smiled harder, said, "Oh yes, I could." She smiled harder and harder. Now, again, I felt like since this aspect was stated, I feel like it showed how invested as well the speaker and the teacher were together because she flowed off the connection from the teacher, as well as the teacher flowed off the connection of the student by even engaging in her to reading her own poem. Lastly, I feel like imagery was very persuaded throughout this whole, was presented throughout this whole poem, but I feel inevitably I feel like the last two lines of the poem were very crucial and very interesting for imagery. We walk silent to the buses, awed by the power of words. I feel like imagery was placed in this in a very great aspect because I can just imagine students just walking in a straight line, being quiet, being, just like, especially after saying something cool or hearing something cool, and it's like you're just in shock and you're just like in awe and like in like a sense of peace and relief, like you're gonna have a great day after school. So I could just imagine the kids just like stepping in there in the school buses and just like wow, and I can imagine their faces as well. I can imagine throughout this whole poem the classroom. I can imagine hearing the school bell ring when it's time for them to leave to go to school. So it's very interesting, and I really appreciate this poem. It actually is an interesting poem, and I would definitely am interested to learn more about Marilyn Nelson. And I feel like I connected with this poem in a deeper level. And again, I hope everybody's staying safe and just have a great day and stay home.